Good morning. It's Friday, June 7th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 245 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. The North is heating up, and I continue to watch that front with trepidation. The Israeli general in charge of the Northern Command says his people are ready. There's a mad dash right now to prevent what could, by all accounts, be the ugliest war the Middle East has ever seen. And there's some serious competition out there for that title. We'll talk about what's happening in the North and more today live here on the FDD Morning Brief. This morning, our guest is Eli Lake. Eli was among the first people I met here in the swamp when I moved here from Philadelphia back in 2002. Eli is also a son of the city of brotherly love, so you know he's smart and talented. He's written for Bloomberg, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and more over the last few years. He's now writing for the Free Press. We'll hear from this journeyman journalist in just a few minutes right here live on the FDD Morning Brief. Axios yesterday reported that President Biden warned Israel not to respond to Hezbollah's onslaught of attacks, warning that Iran might intervene. With all due respect, President Biden, you have some serious chutzpah. First, let's acknowledge that after 10/7, the Israelis didn't want to fight Hamas in Gaza. They wanted to head north. That's because Hezbollah began firing rockets, missiles, and drones at Israel on October 8th. The Israelis were not only looking north because they were taking incoming fire, though. They knew this was the war that needed to be fought. But Biden came to Israel and warned the IDF against it. We all know what happened next. The Israelis went into Gaza, and then Biden refused to let them finish that war anyway. Unbelievable. Since then, more than 5,000 Hezbollah attacks have cleared out 100,000 Israelis from the northern communities. Thanks, Mr. President. Oh, and where do you think Hezbollah got the cash to build up its arsenal of 200,000 rockets and 1,500 precision weapons over the years? Surprise, that was Obama's nuclear deal of 2015 when Biden was vice president. And let's not forget the sanctions relief this White House has granted Iran over the last 3+ years. Iran gives Hezbollah $800 million each year. Outrageous. Biden is not some disinterested party trying to prevent a war. His policies have led to the war that has already erupted. You own this, Mr. President, so give Israel the time, space, and weaponry that it needs to beat Iran's most powerful proxy. Failing that, just get out of the way. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, lots of action out of Gaza yesterday. Hamas terrorists attempted to infiltrate Israel under the cover of fog. The incident started around 4 a.m. Israeli soldiers monitoring surveillance cameras spotted suspicious activity near the Gaza border. Troops were dispatched to the scene. Less than an hour later, the Hamas cell opened fire, and the IDF successfully eliminated 3 terrorists, but 1 Israeli soldier was killed in the clash. This was Hamas's most brazen attack since October 7th, and it all went down mere days after President Biden stood in the White House and proclaimed that Hamas is, quote, no longer capable of carrying out another October 7th, end quote. Right. But let's give the IDF credit here. They've rebooted their surveillance system along the Gaza border after the collapse that occurred on 10/7. It looks like this system is working the way that it's supposed to. And that's a good sign for the residents of the Gaza envelope who want to return to their homes. Headline 2, the IDF took out dozens of Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists embedded inside an UNRWA school. The terrorists were hiding in classrooms. An IDF spokesman said that Israel postponed the strike twice to ensure maximum precision and minimal civilian casualties, but that was predictably lost on the media. The New York Times ran no less than 3 headlines that didn't name Hamas or even include the word terrorist. But maybe they didn't need to. Hamas and UNRWA are practically synonymous at this point. Over the past 8 months of the war, the IDF has uncovered Hamas war rooms, weapons caches, and terror cells inside one UNRWA facility after the next. Heck, UNRWA employees even took part in the onslaught of October 7th. Last week, the Israeli Knesset passed a preliminary bill to designate UNRWA as a terrorist organization. I gotta say, it's past time for Washington to do the same. And headline 3, 17 countries signed a joint statement urging Hamas to accept the ceasefire proposal that President Biden outlined last week. The United States signed on, as did countries from all 4 corners of the world, from Germany and Poland to Thailand, Brazil, and Argentina. Each of the signatories has citizens taken hostage on October 7th. Hamas has categorically rejected the deal so far. Shocker, right? It's equally shocking that the Qataris are back in action, pretending that Hamas is interested in negotiation. Middle East advisor Brett McGurk and CIA Director Bill Burns arrived in Doha on Tuesday. They discussed the terms of the latest ceasefire deal with Egyptian and Qatari meteors, blah, blah, blah. The Egyptians and Qataris held separate meetings with senior Hamas officials. If this thing doesn't move soon, Biden needs to give Israel the green light to finish off Hamas in Rafah. Okay, I'm now pleased to introduce you to Eli Lake, a veteran journalist and foreign policy observer now working for the Free Press. Eli also appears on Commentaries Podcast, a show I occasionally drop in on. And he's rebooting a podcast of his own. We may hear about that as well. So let's hear now from him about what has his attention these days live on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Eli Lake.
Great to be here, Jonathan. Thank you so much for having me.
And I do love that shirt.
Bacon in the gulag.
Yep. All right. Well, let me start by asking you about an article you wrote several months ago about the malign role of Qatar in higher education. That piece is still one of the best ones out there on the topic. So maybe just give us a sense of what you've learned, and are you still tracking that?
Something like $2 billion over since, let's just say, 2001 or so, has gone from Qatar's like one of their fund to support cultural and educational projects into American higher education institutions, and they've created a kind of what they call education city in Doha with some of the most prestigious universities in the country, including Northwestern, which has a journalism program that collaborates with Al Jazeera. But the one that got my attention was Texas A&M, because Texas A&M has one of the world's best nuclear engineering programs. And Texas A&M recently, I should say after my second story on this, their Board of Regents voted to end their partnership with Qatar, which I think is a good sign. And I think it was in part because unlike Northwestern, Texas A&M has to be accountable at some level to the governor of Texas and the Texas state legislature. So, but the point is that, you know, what they're doing is I got a chance to look at the agreement because of a lawsuit and the fact that Texas A&M, again, is a public university. The intellectual property that is generated on the Doha campus will belong essentially to the state of Qatar. Now, that's not unusual if you're talking about an American university, but we allowed that kind of thing and didn't really care about it because for the longest time we said, all right, well, Stanford owns the IP, but Stanford's an American university, and there has been a long tradition in this country, particularly in the 20th century, of collaboration in the hard sciences and so forth, as you know. What happens, though, when the institution that owns the intellectual property is just a cutout for a foreign government? And that, I think, is where that's an underreported story, Jonathan, because when China invests in these kinds of campuses, Qatar I describe as a kind of Janus-faced frenemy. It's like, on the one hand, we have a military base in Qatar. You know, I guess they're helping with these negotiations, which, as you pointed out in the opening monologue, is, not great. But they're also, thick as thieves with the Iranians. They have, joint custody of the largest natural gas fields in the world with the Iranians. So what does it mean when, even if it's not nuclear tech, what does it mean if really important cutting edge research, say in AI or robotics or whatever it is, goes to Qatar? Does that mean that Iran gets access to it? And isn't that a national security question? Particularly if you're talking about potentially weak information security and data sort of systems between the universities. So even though when I talked to Texas A&M, they said, well, we don't teach nuclear engineering courses in Doha. Great. But what if, some IT guy in Doha gets access to the mainframe for your nuclear engineering department in Texas? And that's really important because Texas A&M has shares a contract to manage our nuclear labs like Los Alamos. That's a big deal. Now, again, I'm not saying the Iranians have penetrated that. Obviously, they're countermeasures, but it raises a lot of questions. And let's just say there are things I didn't report in that piece because I couldn't fully nail them down and get them on the record. But there has been some interest from the national security state. Let's just leave it there.
I would hope so. And by the way, I mean, I got to say, I think the Department of Education needs to step up in terms of, demanding better disclosures. I think, there should be
transparency.
I think there should be CFIUS engagement. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that I think should be happening here in Washington to curb the Qatari influence, not only in higher ed, but I think in general in Washington. But maybe that's another piece for anher time.
Well, the law, I mean, the fact that the Qataris have the best law firms, the best PR firms under contract, this creates it creates a kind of sense of influence. Now, we should note, traditionally, Washington has been fairly lax historically in enforcing the Foreign Agents Registration Act until Trump came into power, when it was used as a tool or a weapon to go after Trump associates like Michael Flynn and others. That said, and by the way, I think I agree there should be more enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, but that's not the point. Is that historically the United States we've turned a blind eye to that kind of thing, and we've just sort of allowed lots of foreign countries to have a lot of just official influence in Washington that hasn't been fully documented for what it is, which is advocating for a foreign state. There's usually a cutout, as think tank or a business or something like that.
Yeah. There's, I think, way too much of it. All right. Well, let me switch gears for a minute. I know you've watched Iran and its proxies over the years. You've watched their strategy grow and evolve, just as I have.
And I bet what benefited very much from your expertise and FDD's expertise on this.
Well, we thank you. And we thank you for your continued friendship. What do you think the Axis strategy is right now? I mean, if you look right now, big picture, what do you think the Iranians are doing? And then I think, beyond that, what should the Israelis do? What should we be doing here in the United States? I mean, this is something you've been watching for a while, and I don't know if I've heard your full take.
Well, okay, so I think we should say it starts with the late Qasem Soleimani and just building out these various proxy forces, whether it's the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's the militias in Iraq, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, which obviously precedes Soleimani, or whether it's Hamas, which has kind of, it's interesting because like 10, 12 years ago, if you remember, Hamas leadership was on the fence because of Syria, where Iran was intervening on behalf of Assad. And, I think most of the Arab world opinion was against that. And Hamas is a Sunni organization, of course, but Hamas is now, fully on Team Iran. So that's the first thing, building it up. Sometimes that's called in strategy of encirclement or strangulation or something like that. But now we're in, I would say, kind of phase 2, which is start a war, which is what Hamas did. And you've got all of the other proxies kind of participating it to various degrees, like the Houthis. We've seen rockets launched from Iraq. And of course, what you talked about in the beginning, the Hezbollah rocket war. But this is the other part of it that is so sinister. Then create, I would say, global pressure through international institutions, through media, through kind of domestic activist groups. And I'm not saying that the Iranians are pulling the strings for the campus protests. It's not exactly like that. But the idea is to kind of have this groundswell of pressure so that there is such a high diplomatic and political cost for Israel to defend itself from wars that Iran's proxies start, that it effectively it doesn't, I mean, listen, Israel's defending itself, but it raises the cost. And I think the goal is to make it not worth the candle to respond and eliminate the obvious mortal threats that Israel faces all around it. And I think so that's kind of, we talk about this idea of hybrid warfare, gray zone war. That's how these two kind of things fit together. And we've seen it have, in some ways, a lot of success, at least among the fringe left, maybe less fringe left today, where you saw rallies in New York City that were praising the Houthis for menacing commercial shipping, not even Israel. You saw activists planning to disrupt the Democratic Convention in Chicago this summer, applaud when news came out in a conference. We covered this at the Free Press with my colleague, Olivia Reingold. They got up and applauded when Iran launched their barrage of drones and missiles at Israel. So, there have always been hardline progressives in America. There have always been kind of peace activists. There's a long tradition in America of what might be called anti-imperialism. However, this is the first time that I've seen so many organized groups that weren't just, like fringe campus radicals, literally taking the other side, taking Iran's side, taking the side of Iran's proxies. That is no longer, I care about the humanity of Palestinians. That's just, you're not anti-war. You're on the other side at that point. So how does Iran do that? Well, that to me is murkier, but there certainly is a lot of evidence that there are groups like the People's Forum. I'm not saying they get money from Iran, but they seem to be kind of working hand in glove. And there are some connections, at least with China. And, there seems to be, a strategy now with some of these other groups to basically kind of mainstream them among the American left, the European left. So that's as far as I would willingly go. I don't know. The money I haven't seen, but certainly it seems like the strategy is there.
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I think we are seeing some evidence of sort of Hamas adjacent organizations. We're actually seeing some socialist groups that maybe are also associated with Russia. It's kind of a witch's brew. But let me ask you this. And I think it's somewhat related. We're concerned at FDD about the disinformation campaigns that have found their way into our social media feeds and mainstream media and beyond. And I think that they are connected in part to what we're watching on the streets. And so, and I realize this is possibly a controversial topic, but as a journalist who covers this space and who works for an outlet that's designed to do battle in this space, how do you assess what's happening right now?
Okay, so on this disinformation thing, I have become slightly red-pilled, which is that the people who are in this fairly new industry of countering disinformation have, for the most part, and let's just be straight about this, kind of revealed themselves to be charlatans and hucksters. Now, I use those words very advisedly, which is to say, we were told that Hunter Biden's laptop was Russian fakery. Wrong. It was true. The disinformation was saying that it was a Russian disinformation campaign. We were told that, in a non-foreign policy related issue, well, though with foreign policy implications during the height of COVID, that we couldn't question the science on anything. Now, there are people who are really bad actors that are conspiracy theorists that say the vaccines don't work, and those people are cranks and they should be ignored. But there were legitimate scientists and doctors and people who understood this science that were questioning some of the calls made by government agencies and people who weren't scientists, who were like in, I don't know, like health public diplomacy policy or some other, field. And they were having their social media accounts either throttled or in some cases kicked off, for actually raising legitimate questions about things like the origins of COVID. So the problem with the concept of disinformation and the sort of new policy industry that has just sort of propped up around it in Washington is that it has already been weaponized for partisan advantage. And that discredits the entire point. The other thing I would just say is the concept of disinformation is something that the Soviets invented. And it was a way of basically justifying their own repressive censorship regime. That said, it's also true that the countries, the good guys and the bad guys, engage in information warfare. This is part of modern, military strategy. It has to be. And by the way, it's been part of military strategy since the beginning of warfare. So let's not, but it's certainly something that is a major factor today. So there is I think it's really important to sort of distinguish those brands. And I almost that's why I shudder. I don't like using the word misinformation or disinformation, because it's been, the concept and the field of study has become so thoroughly discredited.
Well, I will say FDD's got a new monograph that we're working on right now. It'll be out soon by FDD's Brad Bowman, where we look at the way in which some of America's adversaries and enemies, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, how they approach this space. But I do take to heart some of your skepticism about.
Well,
this.
it's not just, and of course they do. And by the way, we should just say it's like this is foreign propaganda. It's really easy to do this to disguise the hand of the propaganda in the era of social media. So I'm all for things like, policies or regulations that require transparency, so that if a site claims to be, Freedom America USA, but it's really a bunch of, web monkeys in Tehran or something, then there should be full disclosure, and that's really important. So I'm all for that. My problem is that, when you're talking about some of these people who are in the field, what they almost are promoting a kind of conspiracy theory that like Americans elected Donald Trump because of a couple Facebook memes. And that's ridiculous. And it also undermines the legitimacy of our democracy. So
you start
I just think we have to make some fine distinctions here.
Yeah, it's obviously that's gaslighting, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Eli Lake, want to thank you for joining us today here on the FDD Morning Brief. Hope you'll come back, and
Will do.
Appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague John Hardy has a detailed piece in FDD's Long War Journal on Russia's latest military technology that's popped up on the battlefield, the UMBP-D-30SN glide bomb. That's a lot. John highlights that Russia's Air Force requires large quantities of standoff precision-guided munitions, and it's working to offset its previous deficit with these new weapons. This, he notes, will exacerbate Ukraine's existing challenges with air defense shortages. There's no other way to put it, folks. I am worried about Ukraine. My colleague Joe Truzman has been keeping a close eye on the menagerie of terrorist squads that have been popping up in the West Bank in the aftermath of October 7th. He's got a live interactive map on FDD's website that breaks down the details on the more than 4,000 terror attacks in that theater over the last 2 years. The last day or so has seen some pitched battles. By the way, Joe's work was acknowledged in a somewhat weird way by the State Department yesterday. They sanctioned a group that Joe first brought to our attention some 2 years ago, a violent Palestinian group in the West Bank called the Lion's Den. It was also odd because the group has been defunct for about a year, and it was sanctioned under the same authority that state has used to target Israeli settlers. Just really bizarre all around. And finally, FDD's Foreign Policy podcast will be dropping a new episode later today that you don't want to miss. FDD Chief Executive Mark Dubowitz guest hosts a conversation with the insightful Iranian-American analyst Kareem Sajapur. While Mark and Kareem were on opposite sides of the Iran nuclear deal debate in 2015, they recorded a conversation this week where they analyzed what's working and what's not in U.S.-Iran policy. In typical FDD fashion, they also brainstormed some bipartisan solutions that could help forge a sensible path forward. I encourage you to check that one out. Okay, that's a wrap. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X @FDD. And as always, please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Have a great weekend. Tune in Monday for another riveting episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.